All right, so today's class for plants for food and fiber, we're looking at topic 3, which is plant reproduction and breeding. And we are going to split the lesson into 2 parts. So today we'll look at types of reproduction and we'll look at cones and flowers. All right, so we're going to start by talking about something called selective breeding. So this is when people can choose specific plants with specific characteristics and then basically breed these plants together to reproduce. So for example, maybe we want a plant that has a higher yield, maybe it has more protein, maybe it has some insect resistance. So people can choose those qualities or those characteristics and then breed them together. And that's called selective breeding. An example is the modern corn plant. It does not resemble the plant from which it was bred. People wanted, for example, corn with large ears. So they removed the weaker, smaller plants until they were growing only corn that grew large ears. All right, so therefore more yield, more food. So plants are bred for their ability to withstand environmental conditions, how much food or fiber they produce, and even their resistance to disease. Another quality or characteristic that people are looking for or farmers look for is how well a food stores and ships. So these are other factors that are considered. For example, how long of a shelf life will this food have, right? So for example, tomatoes. Tomatoes are bred for example, resistance to disease, larger tomatoes, and how long of a shelf life they would have. This example here, sweetheart cherries, they were developed by the Summerland Research Center in BC, and they have been bred to have firm, split-resistant skin and strong green stems. All right, so quick video here we'll watch on plant breeding and how it solves problems. All right, so next we'll talk about new genes, but first we'll talk about what are genes. So genes are the parts of a cell that control the organism's characteristics. So like the DNA, which we find in, like, for example, the nucleus of a cell. So scientists have the ability now to make changes to plants by changing their genes. So what they can do is they can combine genes from other plants. That new plant that they create will have characteristics that come partly from one kind of a plant and partly from another kind of plant. And this is called genetic engineering or genetic modification. So examples of this include grains and fruits that can resist viruses, tomatoes that will ripen more slowly, therefore resulting in better flavor and color. And another example would be rice that has high levels of vitamin A. Another example is here, plants that glow. So what scientists have done is they've taken DNA from bioluminescent mushrooms. Scientists have created these plants that can now glow in the dark. So what was done, a team of MIT research, they've engineered plants that glow in the dark using luciferase. Luciferase is an enzyme that they took from fireflies. So fireflies are able to light up basically their butts. They're able to light them up and glow in the dark. So scientists were able to take that gene from fireflies and insert it into plants, and now you have these plants that can glow. All right, next we're going to look at types of reproduction. 2 types. First type is sexual reproduction. This involves specialized seeds and fruits of 2 plants. So it will require male and female gametes. When we look at asexual reproduction. This is also called vegetative reproduction, and this occurs when a parent plant grows plants from its roots, its stems, or from its leaves. When we have asexual reproduction, the young plants are going to be exactly identical to the parent. All right, so the DNA, the genetics will be exactly the same as the parent plant. So some examples of asexual or vegetative reproduction. One is grafting. So in this diagram here, grafting is when you can take the branch of one tree and attach it to another. Another example is cuttings. This is when you can take small sections of leaf and stems, cut from the parent plant, and then replant it. All right, so a new plant will be produced by taking a cutting. All right, now keep in mind, when we talk about grafting or cuttings, the plants will be the same as the parent plant. All right, so genetically, they will be exactly the same. So when we talk about sexual reproduction and seed plant reproduction, the first type we're going to talk about is cones. And so when plants reproduce using seeds, the resulting plants will all be different from their parents, okay, not identical. And we talk about more of this as we get more into science, like in grade 8 and 9. But for now, you just need to know that whenever we talk about sexual reproduction or seed plant reproduction, the new plant will not be identical to the parent plant. So cones, we'll talk about cones first. This is the part of the tree. It has a series of wooden scales. And if you look at this diagram here, these cones, they can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. The female cones will contain the ovules. The ovules are also called the eggs. The male cones will contain pollen grains, and these pollen grains contain the sperm. So for pollination to occur, pollination is when pollen travels to the female cone. That is the process of pollination. So this can occur by, for example, wind. Wind can carry pollen to the female cones. So for example, in this diagram here, which is from the textbook, we have the female cone here, and then we have the male cone here. All right, so the male cone has these little structures here called the pollen grains. And here we're looking at the female cone just in a little bit more detail here. So we can see the ovule here in the female cone, which is also the egg. So the pollen grains, maybe by wind or insects or so on, will reach the ovule right here. All right. The pollen will get caught in the sticky fluid. There's usually like a sticky fluid near the ovule, and that pollen grain will then kind of stick here. Then a pollen tube will grow down from the pollen grain to the ovule. A tiny fertilized seed will then begin to grow. So female cones, they can mature, open, and release their seeds during fall or winter. It can take almost 2 years from when the pollen lands on the female cone until the time the seeds are released. The seeds can then be carried away. They might be eaten or buried by animals, and then eventually the seeds will sprout and then grow into new pine trees, for example. All right, next we're going to talk about flowers. So again, we're still looking at sexual reproduction. So when we look at flowers, the main job of flowers and the petals that we see on flowers is to attract insects and other animals. This will allow the spread of the plant pollen to other plants, which will lead to pollination. So these animals, they can pollinate the flowers while they're feeding on the flowers' nectar and pollen. Now, keep in mind, not all flowers are large and showy. Some flowers will depend on wind to spread their pollen, so therefore their petals may be tiny, or they may not have any petals. Some flowers open at nighttime. So instead of having large colorful petals, they will have strong scents to guide insects and other pollinators towards them. All right, so those are all like their adaptations. All right, so next we're going to start looking at the parts of a flower. Okay, so parts of a flower, talk about the petals first. So here, for example, is one petal. It's the brightly colored part. It basically advertises to insects and other pollinators that it's got tasty nectar or pollen. Here we have the sepals down here. The sepal has a function basically for protecting the flower. So it's usually green, it's underneath the flower, it's there to protect the flower before it opens. Okay, so we'll talk about the male reproductive organ first in flowers. The male reproductive organ, it is called the stamen. So the whole thing is called a stamen. And we could see a bunch of them in this flower. So all of these here are the stamen. So the top part of the stamen, we have this part here, and that is called the anther. And that is where pollen is produced and stored. We also have a label showing the pollen grains. So again, the pollen grains contain the sperm, which are the male reproductive cells. We also have the stalk-like structure, that's called the filament. And it's just there for support, it supports the anther. Okay, so to have it supported and also kind of projecting out of the flower for easier access for pollinators. All right, so next we're going to look at the female reproductive organ. It's labeled here on the right side. The whole structure, all of this, is called the pistil. So the pistil is the female reproductive organ. The very top of the structure is called the stigma. The stigma is sticky and it will capture pollen grains, so pollen grains will stick onto the stigma. Next is this stalk-like structure here. That is called the style. It's there for support. It's holding up the stigma. Next, here in this area, we have the ovary. So this whole structure here is called the ovary. It's the swollen base of the pistil. It contains the ovules. So inside of here, we have the smaller structures called the ovules. These are also called the eggs, which contain the female reproductive cells. So just looking at those parts in a little bit more close-up detail. So the male parts of a flower, so like I said before, the whole structure is called the stamen. The top part is called the anther, and the stalk-like structure is called the filament. So the filament is the stalk for support. The anther, this is where pollen is produced and stored. The number of stamens on a plant can vary. So if we look at this previous diagram, there were many stamens. All right, the female parts of a flower, so just looking at it a little bit more close up. The whole structure is called the pistil. It's got the three main parts. The top part is called the stigma. That's the sticky tip of the pistil that allows it to catch the pollen. Then we have the style. It's just like a tube-like structure. It connects the stigma and the ovary. And then lastly is the ovary here. It's the swollen base, and it holds the ovules, which are the eggs inside. All right, so inside the ovary are the plant's ovules, which are the eggs.